So while all metrics are very important, citations are also still important. I just want to get that point across. And I'll talk a little bit about how those things relate. So I'm not a bibliometrician myself. I work on Scopus, which is one of the main data sources for citations out there, which is used for a lot of these assessment exercises. So the one that was mentioned a couple times already, the REF in the UK, Scopus is a citation data provider for that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more here. So this is just a model I have to try to figure out what measures you should be using when. So what level are you looking at? And this is where I think a lot of the confusion happens. Are you looking at an article, journal, researcher? It matters what you're trying to assess to figure out how to assess it. If you are assessing those things, what exactly are you trying to learn? What's the purpose? If you're looking at a researcher, are you looking at the social impact of their work or at the academic impact of their work? Because only once you know what level you're looking at and what you're actually trying to learn about them, can you start to look at and figure out what metrics you're going to use to measure. And that could be citations or some of the alt metrics, but it could also be more qualitative peer review. There's different processes. Most of the big national assessment exercises use a variation of all of these. Scopus citations are just one component of the REF. I mentioned there's a lot of confusion with this. So with the REF exercise, we've specifically made it explicit that we're not using journal-level metrics in any way to assess people. There's still huge amounts of confusion, though. When you talk to researchers in the UK, they won't believe you that journal metrics aren't being used because they're so used to them being abused in that way, and I'll talk more about that later. So one example of how these things can be confused are article-level metrics and alt metrics. Oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. And I think it does actually hurt both of these concepts in their development that they're stuck together in that way. And the more we start to think of these as separate concepts, I think the more we'll see adoption of them across the industry. One important point, one of the most important article-level metrics is actually citations, which are anything but alt metrics. They're about as traditional as you get. PLOS, who started article-level metrics, has citations as one of the key things that they're showing. And if you don't yet have Scopus cited by counts on your journal pages, you should go get them. They're free. We make it extremely easy to get those cited by counts up there. So the other place where there's a lot of confusion, obviously, again, I've mentioned it with the REF, but it happened so often in the past, which is where DORA came from. Impact factor, journal level impact factor, has been misused to assess all sorts of other things it was never designed to assess. So that's a current situation we're in. I'm going to show some research now, a little bit more about a different angle of that current situation, and then also how I think there's some hope for the future. There was an earlier session today. Adrian was in talking about doing market research. So this is actually some of the market research that came out of his group. I just wanted to give a little bit of the background of the study because I think because of it is a very well constructed study with a very good sample size that there's some significant meanings coming out of it. I think it makes the power of the numbers a little bit better. So 50,000 researchers were asked, about 3,500 of them answered. These are the measures they know about as far as impact. This is just awareness here. You can see impact factor, fairly well known among the respondents. H-index, also fairly well known. And then the third, most well known, is usage. And that's down to 10%. So there's a big drop off there. And the other 6 or 7 metrics that we asked about were all below that 10%. Going down to the very bottom with the least known of all the metrics that was mentioned, and that was alt metrics. Only 1% of the respondents had ever heard the term. So we talk about it a lot. We've all been hearing about it for a number of years now. But the general researcher population, 1% versus 82%. And that's why the impact factor is misused, because people know it. And we'll see a little bit more data on that. So that was just what people were aware of. We then followed up with a question, what is actually useful of these things? Notice impact factor, that's that top one there. And then the other long one down there with 58% is the H-index. So not only do researchers know these exist, but they also assume they're the best metrics we just see a correlation there. That's what this shows here, that awareness at least correlates to thinking that they're useful. Now, these are, of course, just the general researcher population. They're not bibliometricians. In most cases, they're probably not the ones that are running the research assessment exercises. But this is the current state of affairs. So all metrics, 1%, 82% impact factor. And people really think the impact factor is still the way to be assessing things. And by a lot more than anything else. So that was one aspect of it. But then we asked, what do you think when you break it down by demographics? So that last one was just showing the overall usefulness that people felt. If you break it down by demographics, and here we're looking, the far left-hand column is under 35-year-old researchers, and then the far right column over 65. Everywhere there's a green check mark or a red check mark is where there's a statistically significant difference from the median. So if you look at the far left column, green, 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 green. Researchers under 35 think basically any metric we asked, is that going to be useful? They think it's going to be more useful than the general researcher population. One of the things O'Reilly said is you want to be designing for the future, the world, rather than today. Those researchers are the ones that are in the future that we need to start to build things for. More senior researchers, on the other hand, you see not so excited about different metrics. Another interesting demographic difference there, if you look at different regions. So notice the second column there, APAC. There's not a single metric that APAC researchers didn't rate is higher and more interesting, is something they want to be assessed on. You can also see that there's a lot of green check marks in Latin America, Eastern Europe. Basically, a lot of these more emerging areas are really excited about any type of measurement they can get their hands on. While Western Europe isn't quite as excited. You can see here that they've had a lot of research assessment over the years, and they're not as excited about new options or existing options. But again, the places where we're seeing fast growth in research output are places that are looking for more of this information for the articles they publish. I'm going to go back to DORA. So one of the things that was suggested there, well, it said, reduce emphasis on the journal impact factor. I agree with that. By presenting the metric in context of a variety of journal-based metrics. So what I would like to show are a couple of those that we have, and which are SNP and SGR. Many of you have probably heard of them before. Still very low on researcher awareness scale, and what we saw, awareness does lead to people starting to understand them and believe in them a little bit more. So it's important that we get these out there. These are, I would call them, they're not alt metrics because they're based on citations, and even at a journal level. But they are semi-alternative in that they're not the impact factor. They both have strengths over and above the impact factor. Many of the things in the DORA critique of how the impact factor is being used. When these metrics were designed, we specifically worked with our partners to try to improve upon some of the former things. So SNP is actually a metric done by CWTS at Leiden University, which is a bibliometrics group, and SGR is Scamago Journal Rank, which is done by Scamago, which is a bibliometrics group in Spain. So both of these are calculated independently from Elsevier. We just provide the Scopus data, they do the calculation. There's papers published on how they do it. Some of the changes they've made, it's much more transparent than how the impact factor is done. Pardon me. And these are all freely out there and available for you to go see at journalmetrics.com. The normalization is key, and I'm going to talk a little bit about SNP in detail just to give an idea of what that subject field normalization means. So both of these metrics have also just recently been updated. Last year, each of these, the second generation of these metrics came out. Just like Google's PageRank is constantly improving to use the best new algorithms that are out there, that's the same for these journal metrics. They're constantly improving. Scamago Journal Rank is actually very similar to PageRank in its structure. It's a prestige ranking, which is the same type of algorithm as PageRank. SNP is, I think, a little bit easier to understand for people, Both of them, with the new way we've done it now, we've made them much easier to understand the meaning of the score, because you do have to have context. Any journal that scores above a 1, that's above the average. Below 1, below the average. It doesn't matter what discipline in either of these metrics, but especially SNP. So SNP starts with the raw impact as a numerator, so very similar to what an impact factor would be, calculated slightly differently, looking at only peer-reviewed papers there in the numerator. And then it's divided by the citation potential. So what that's doing is looking at the co-citation network of a paper. So if you look at a life sciences paper, it's cited by other life sciences papers. So it's clustering journals based on their actual behaviors rather than some preconceived subject classification. When it does that, it can then divide that raw impact by that potential. So it's easier to see that here and what that actually means. You can take two journals that it would be extremely hard to compare using impact factor. The molecular cell, the raw impact we calculated 13 compared to 1.5. It's very hard to compare these. With this, it balances out, and you can see that they actually have a much closer impact in the end. This starts to become more and more important, especially as more interdisciplinary journals are out there. You want to make sure you're comparing, giving those interdisciplinary journals a fair shot. So I mentioned the importance of transparency. We also, in Scopus, provide other information like that. So percent review articles is just one example. If a journal has a lot of review articles, that could artificially inflate its, well, it could inflate its impact, not being original research. It could inflate the impact of SNP and SGR also. That's one thing our algorithms couldn't account for. So we provide that data to give context so people can understand if very high percentage of review articles that maybe that SNP or SGR isn't as high as it looks in comparison. So you always want to provide that extra level of context whenever you can. So the suggestion from Dora, get alternative journal metrics up there alongside the impact factor on your journal homepages. And Elsevier is starting to do that. This is a new portal that they've started to create on some of the journal homepages with quality, speed, and authors. If you go into quality, I'm not live on the web here, you can start to see visualizations looking at SNP, looking at SJR, also looking at impact factor, and some of the raw data as well. So it gives you a holistic picture of these different metrics to give a more complete view. And we have tried to make this quite easy. I mentioned this here. They're available through APIs, so you can embed these on your website and they'll stay up to date. We try to make that as easy as possible for publishers to do. So one of the last things I want to talk about is an initiative that was already mentioned a couple times called Snowball Metrics. The third point here, benchmark themselves against their peers. That's really what this is largely exercise in trying to create better ways to benchmark according to the way that the academic institutions themselves want to benchmark against their competitors. So this was done in partnership with a number of universities in the UK and Elsevier. So it was a joint partnership to work with them to try to create this system for sharing all sorts of different types of metrics and with standards in a way that you can have meaningful comparisons. So what has come out of that is a booklet that talks about these different metrics and how what's available there, and that's freely available. So we can't talk about everything with research assessment today, but this booklet is free to download, and it's actually one of the best ways to start learning more about research assessment, institutional assessment, and how the institutions are themselves starting to benchmark themselves. So just to summarize some of the points I mentioned, you want to choose the right methods and metrics. If you're measuring a journal, you can use a journal metric. SNP or SJR would be preferable. If you don't want to confuse level with type. It leads to problems. We've seen this lead to problems already with the impact factor being misused to analyze things that it was never meant to analyze. We don't want to make the same mistake moving forward with these new metrics. Article level metrics, alt metrics, they're different. We should treat them differently. One's about the level, One's about the type of metrics. Awareness of metrics correlates to acceptance. We saw that research data that researchers like the impact factor just because they know it exists. At least that's my interpretation of it. They like the H-index because they know it exists. It's easy, it's a single number, easy to calculate. The only way that perspective is going to change is if researchers start to become more comfortable with some other numbers, thus getting SNP and SJR onto your journal homepages. This is the future. APAC, younger researchers, Latin America, they're all thirsting for these new metrics, on different metrics to help with their research assessment. Use a whole bunch of them. Pretty straightforward there. And last, you should be about transparency and standards are very important when you're trying to compare things. It's a simple concept, but it's something that in many cases hasn't always been the case. And that Snowball project is actually one that's a very good example of how this is actually coming to play in action. Thank you.